strange trace appeared on radar. Small, erratic, too slow for a jet, too high for a chopper. It was April 1975, and the aircraft carrier USS Midway held station in a sea of panic. Her flight deck, built for order and precision, had become a maze of helicopters and fuel drums. The massive metal groaned under the weight of America's urgent evacuation from Vietnam. And now this. Something unusual was flying toward her, but no one could immediately say from where or why. The mighty Midway had seen wars begin and end, but she'd never seen this kind of aircraft on this kind of approach. Midway was a fortress built for battle, now forced to decide if the power that won wars was worth throwing away on a single unknown. USS Midway was more than a warship. She was a floating city at sea, home to 4,500 men who lived, worked, and fought aboard her steel decks. She was the result of a 5-year design effort that filled 90 tons of blueprints. First imagined by the Bureau of Ships during the darkest years of the war, Midway embodied the Admiral's dream, a carrier as tough as a battleship, yet capable of launching over 120 aircraft into the sky. Engineers wrestled with problems of weight, balance, and armor that had no precedent. Yet when the plans were finally approved, wartime shipyards turned them into steel in record time. With round-the-clock shifts and America's industrial machine at full throttle, Midway went from keel laying to launch in just 17 months. Despite this, she was commissioned too late to fight in World War II, but she was nonetheless a marvel of engineering. At 295 meters long, with a beam of 41, she displaced nearly 60,000 tons fully loaded. Her 4 turbines and 12 boilers generated 212,000 horsepower, enough to drive the massive hull through the sea at 33 knots. She bristled with firepower. 18 5-inch Mark 16 guns, designed initially for Montana-class battleships, 21 quadruple 40mm Beaufort mounts, and 20 twin Ehrlichen cannons. Her armor was equally formidable, being up to 165mm around the conning tower and nearly 200mm along the belt. Unlike her predecessors, she carried a steel flight deck that could take punishment and keep operating long after a wooden deck would have splintered. As her design matured and the Navy continued to push her limits, Midway was eventually rated for 136 aircraft, including Corsairs, Hellcats, and Helldivers, ready to range out across the Pacific. Her cruising range stretched 15,000 miles at 15 knots, enough to reach any ocean. Such scale and capability didn't come cheap. She cost twice as much as an Essex-class carrier, so much that sailors joked the first of her class was practically made of gold, both for its cost and for its cutting-edge technology. Though built for propeller-driven aircraft, Midway was designed with the future in mind, becoming a warship whose scale and capability would shape naval aviation for decades to come. And as the Cold War dawned, with Korea smoldering, China in upheaval, and the Soviet Union rising, she embodied something larger than her hull, America's promise to project power anywhere, anytime, for as long as the seas endured. With the Cold War looming, the Navy needed to know if its newest supercarrier could do more than fight the last war. The next enemy was the Soviet Union, and its frontier lay in the frozen north. As such, in late 1946, Midway was ordered into the Arctic for Operation Frostbite. The mission proved that a carrier designed for tropical seas could survive and fight in sub-zero conditions. Freezing spray coated her flight deck in layers of ice as thick as armor. Sailors chopped and hacked at the frozen surface just to keep it safe for aircraft. Catapults strained, arrestor cables stiffened, and every takeoff meant fighting a runway slick with frost. Into this weather, Ryan FR-1 Fireballs, experimental hybrids with both piston engines and jets, hurtled off her bow into gray skies heavy with snow. HOS-1 helicopters skimmed the frigid waves, rehearsing rescues by plucking dummies, and sometimes men, from the near-freezing sea. The tests were punishing, but they worked. Midway had proven that a carrier could fight in the Arctic, but only with constant effort and adaptation. The following year, she was called on to break boundaries again. In September 1947, Midway hosted Operation Sandy. A captured German V-2 rocket the same weapon that had terrorized London, was bolted to a wooden stand on her flight deck. Only Midway could attempt it. At 60,000 tons, with the Navy's largest and strongest deck, she was the only ship thought capable of handling the 14-meter, 12-ton rocket. Launching from sea also meant that any failure would rain debris into the Atlantic instead of an American city. And as the fleet's newest supercarrier, Midway was chosen to trial concepts too risky for older decks. When the rocket ignited, it thundered skyward in a pillar of fire before breaking apart at 15,000 feet, raining debris into the ocean. Even in failure, the test proved that Midway's sheer size and resilience made her the natural testbed for the Navy's boldest experiments in the missile age. By 1952, the familiar growl of piston engines was giving way to something sharper. Jet aircraft, faster and heavier than anything that had come before, were becoming the new standard in naval aviation. That year, USS Midway joined Operation Mainbrace, a massive NATO exercise in the North Atlantic. For her, this was the definitive test of whether a World War II carrier like herself could survive going forward. More than 200 ships and 1,000 aircraft from the United States, Britain, Canada, Denmark, and Norway assembled in the grey swells between Norway and Scotland, the most significant peacetime naval force the world had ever seen. From Midway's bow, Panthers and Banshees clawed into the sky, carrying out simulated strikes on enemy positions in Denmark and Norway. Sky Raiders lumbered off her catapults with full bomb loads, diving against mock targets ashore. Over the fleet, Midway's fighters played the role of shield, scrambling to intercept British and American bombers, standing in as Soviet attackers. Jets were faster, heavier, and more challenging to handle than the Corsairs and Hellcats of the 40s. Bringing one down on a straight flight deck meant lining up with little room for error. A slight miscalculation could send an aircraft sliding into parked planes or crashing into the island. To solve this, British engineers had devised a radical idea: angle the landing area a few degrees off to port, giving jets extra room to recover from a bad approach. The Navy wasn't ready to build new carriers yet, so Midway would serve as the test platform. During Mainbrace, her crew painted angled landing lines across the deck, providing pilots a visual guide to simulate the offset approach. Upon an area 8 to 10 degrees off the ship's axis, the concept worked. For the first time, a missed landing didn't mean disaster. The success of these trials helped convince the Navy to adopt angled decks for real, with USS Antietam becoming the first American carrier to receive the modification. Following this, Midway shed her wartime identity as CVB-41 and was reclassified as CVA-41, officially becoming an attack carrier tailored for jet warfare. On December 27th, she sailed for Norfolk on a world cruise that would put her capabilities to the test on the global stage. With her crew still learning to master the pace of the nascent jet age, Midway carved a path through the Atlantic by way of the Cape of Good Hope before joining the 7th Fleet. She pressed east, cutting through the Mediterranean and slipping through the narrow Suez Canal, her bridge and radar towers dwarfing fishing boats and ferries as she squeezed into the Red Sea. From there, Midway entered the Indian Ocean, one of the first jet-capable American carriers to operate in those waters, a visible signal of U.S. reach in the Cold War. By early 1955, her crews had carried her into crisis. Across the Taiwan Strait, communist artillery thundered against the nationalist-held Tachin Islands, just 200 miles north of Formosa. The People's Liberation Army was massing troops and building up firepower, intent on seizing the outposts and tightening its grip on the strait. For Washington, the stakes were clear: either let an ally fall or step in and risk a wider war with China to show America's commitment. As the evacuation unfolded, the beaches filled with shouting, movement, and desperation. Thousands of nationalist soldiers and civilians scrambled toward waiting transports, families clutching what they could carry, even dragging pigs and chickens up crude gangways. Communist artillery tested the edges of the evacuation zone with scattered fire, but Midway's patrols remained overhead, ready to respond if the situation escalated. By the time the last transport cleared the beaches, Midway's air wing had covered the withdrawal of 15,000 troops and more than 20,000 civilians. The operation ended without a shot from her own guns, yet the constant presence of her jets sent a signal across the Pacific. Here was a forward-deployed, jet-capable strike carrier demonstrating U.S. naval power. Each maneuver, each overflight, each port call reassured allies and warned potential adversaries, even as Midway had still never fired a shot in anger. Midway pressed on with a global tour, operating from the Philippines and Japan as part of 7th Fleet duty. There, her aviators sharpened their skills and worked alongside Allied forces, preparing for the kind of Cold War flashpoints that seemed to loom on every horizon. With her cruise complete, she turned east across the Pacific, touching at Hawaii before steaming home. By mid-1955, she'd completed her circumnavigation and returned to the United States. Soon after, the Navy charted a new course for her future. With the jet age in full force, the Navy decided to rebuild Midway from the hangar deck up to keep her relevant. On June 28, 1955, USS Midway steamed into Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Under the ambitious SCB-110 modernization program, her flight deck was ripped open and rebuilt into something far larger. Her overall beam increased by 64 feet and reshaped to handle aircraft nearly twice the size of those she had launched in 1945. Massive steam catapults replaced her older hydraulic systems, built to handle the heavier jet aircraft entering service, including supersonic-capable designs. New arresting gear bristled with power, built to absorb the crushing impact of fighters hitting the deck at 150 miles per hour. The changes went deeper. Her elevators were enlarged and repositioned, allowing aircraft to be moved between the hangar and deck with greater efficiency. Inside, hangar bays were reconfigured with heavier cranes, larger workshops, and expanded fuel systems to keep pace with engines that devoured kerosene at alarming rates. Hangar spaces also gained stronger hoists, allowing crews to service larger engines and more complex avionics. Bomb magazines were enlarged to accommodate both conventional and nuclear weapons of the era. Towering above it all was Midway's first permanent angled flight deck. Set at a 10.5-degree angle, fully reinforced, it gave pilots a genuine margin of safety for the first time. When she emerged in 1957, Midway was hardly recognizable. She was broader, more powerful, and most importantly, ready for the jet age. In March 1965, USS Midway finally crossed the threshold from deterrent to combatant. The Cold War's uneasy chess match gave way to open war, and Midway was the first American carrier to hurl strikes into North Vietnam. Her decks thundered with the roar of jet engines as A-4 Skyhawks, F-4B Phantoms, and A-1 Sky Raiders clawed into the sky, disappearing into humid air heavy with monsoon clouds. Pilots who had trained for years in simulated war now flew north over a landscape crisscrossed with rivers, rice paddies, and a web of anti-aircraft guns waiting to rip them apart. Their targets were bridges, radar sites, and supply depots. Everything that kept Hanoi's war machine alive. The AGM-12 Bullpup missile made its combat debut from her decks, guided manually by a pilot's joystick as it streaked into hardened bunkers and gun positions. It wasn't long before Midway's air wing faced its first test against enemy fighters. Sleek, Soviet-built MiG-17s rose to challenge the intruders. The duels were fast and brutal, featuring jets twisting at the edge of their limits, vapor trails whipping across the sky. On June 17th, Commander Lewis Page and his radar intercept officer, Lieutenant John C. Smith, locked their AIM-7 Sparrow missiles onto two enemy fighters and fired. Both MiGs disintegrated in the sky, giving the Navy its first confirmed air victories of Vietnam, proving that a carrier built for prop planes could still send jet fighters into knife fights with a new generation of adversaries and win. The victories came at a cost. Skyhawks and Phantoms fell to withering anti-aircraft fire, their pilots ejected into uncertain skies, while deck crews immediately prepared replacements. By the time she steamed back into Alameda on November 23rd, Midway had completed her scheduled tour. After months of continuous strikes off North Vietnam, she returned home, having proven herself as a forward-deployed warship, fully capable of sustaining high-tempo jet combat operations in hostile waters. Midway was beginning to show the strain of trying to stay forever relevant in the jet age. Heavier aircraft, faster engines, bulkier payloads pushed her elevators, catapults, and arresting gear to their limits. What had been cutting edge in the 1950s was now precarious. In rough seas, flight operations turned risky, and her angled deck, once a revolution, no longer offered enough margin for supersonic jets clawing into the sky. To stay relevant, Midway entered the San Francisco Bay Naval Shipyard with the most ambitious overhaul of her career, SCB 101.66. Work began in February 1966. The flight deck expanded from 2.8 to 4 acres, giving pilots room to maneuver supersonic fighters safely. The landing area's angle increased to 13.5 degrees, expanding her ability to launch aircraft during recoveries. Below deck, her elevators were torn out and replaced with larger, stronger platforms rated for almost twice the weight, capable of hoisting the Navy's heaviest strike aircraft and nuclear-capable attack aircraft. New steam catapults replaced aging systems, arresting gear was reinforced, and even her interiors were upgraded with centralized air conditioning to support increasingly complex electronics. When Midway was recommissioned on January 31st, 1970, she was taller, heavier, and more powerful than ever. But the upgrades came at a price. Her altered balance worsened seakeeping, and in heavy seas, her wider, steeper decks turned into a dangerous arena. In rough seas, she rolled harder, her flight deck pitching at angles that made takeoffs and landings hazardous. Pilots found themselves fighting not only their jets, but the ship beneath them. The Navy couldn't afford to have its most modernized carrier compromised by her own design, so a second wave of corrections followed, aimed at taming the beast they'd created. Hull reinforcements and ballast adjustments steadied her keel, while stabilization tweaks tried to smooth out her motion. Flight operations demanded their own fixes. Catapults were re-engineered to launch even heavier jets without faltering, thereby reducing the risk of underpowered takeoffs when the deck surged beneath them. Arresting gear was strengthened again, giving pilots a larger margin of safety against the ship's unpredictable pitch and roll. Even the elevators had to be recalibrated, their systems tuned so that aircraft rose and descended smoothly instead of lurching in mid-transfer. Despite the $202 million price tag, more than double the original budget, the modernization and subsequent corrections cemented Midway's status as a carrier capable of projecting American air power globally. On May 18, 1971, Midway steamed back into the Vietnam War, sliding into Yankee Station to relieve Hancock. Within hours, her flight deck was alive again, her phantoms, corsairs, and intruders roaring into the haze, bound for the jungles and river valleys of Vietnam. She joined Coral Sea, Kitty Hawk, and Constellation in a coordinated strike, laying naval mines that choked North Vietnam's ports. Thanh Hoa, Dong Hoi, Vinh, and Haiphong were seeded with explosives, timed to arm 72 hours later. On August 7th, a Phantom went down northwest of Vinh, and HC-7 Detachment 110 launched a daring helicopter mission from Midway to retrieve it. Their helicopter skimmed ridges, glowing with tracer fire, searchlights stabbing through the smoke as deck crews held their breath while following the rescue in real time via radio. The pilot was lifted safely aboard an LPD, marking the deepest helicopter penetration into North Vietnam since 1968. By year's end, 48 pilots had been recovered, 35 under enemy fire. These daring operations were the culmination of years of continuous combat. Midway had made history before, downing the first MiGs in Southeast Asia in 1965, and now she closed the arc of the air war, scoring the last air-to-air victory on January 12, 1973, when a McDonnell F-4B Phantom II downed a MiG-17. The campaign culminated on October 5, 1973, as Midway dropped anchor in Yokosuka, Japan, becoming the first full-carrier task group to be forward deployed at a Japanese port, a milestone enabled by a U.S.-Japan agreement reached the previous year. Families came aboard, allowing sailors to stay with their loved ones while in port. Strategically, the deployment enabled 3 carriers to remain in East Asia, even as budget pressures demanded reductions elsewhere in the fleet. By April 1975, South Vietnam was in the process of collapsing. Washington ordered Operation Frequent Wind, a desperate airlift to pull out Americans and South Vietnamese allies before Saigon fell. USS Midway was called to the front. At dawn on April 29th, the first Hueys staggered over the horizon, bulging with families crammed into every corner. Marines ripped open doors and dragged people out. Men, women, children, infants swaddled in blankets, while deck crews shoved the empty birds aside to clear space for the next wave. One after another, overloaded choppers poured in, some landing on skids bent from strain, others running out of fuel and splashing into the sea alongside the ship. Rescue boats fished survivors from the waves, while flight deck crews risked their lives, guiding each trembling machine onto the deck. The situation reached a breaking point when Major Buang Lee coaxed his tiny Cessna 01 bird dog toward the South China Sea. In the cramped cockpit with him were his wife and 5 children, their only hope of escaping the advancing North Vietnamese. Midway's lookout spotted the fragile plane circling overhead with its landing lights turned on. The crew attempted to contact him on emergency channels, but all they received was silence. Major Buang dropped a note onto the deck saying, quote, "Can you move the helicopter to the other side? I can land on your runway. I can fly for 1 hour more. We have enough time to move. Please rescue me." Captain Larry Chambers, the ship's commanding officer, immediately ordered the arresting wires removed and called for any helicopters that could not be safely moved to be pushed over the side. Volunteers swarmed the deck, heaving Hueys into the sea to clear a path. Millions of dollars gone in seconds. Midway turned into the wind at 25 knots. With rain falling and visibility low, the bird dog lined up, descended, and bounced hard onto the flight deck, then rolled to a safe stop. The crew erupted in cheers. Major Buang had pulled off the impossible, the first fixed-wing landing by a Vietnamese pilot on an aircraft carrier. By the mid-1980s, Midway had been forward deployed in Japan for over a decade, her presence a permanent fixture in the Pacific. But years of service and heavier aircraft demanded yet another overhaul. In 1986, she entered a refit known as the Extended Incremental Selected Repair Availability. The Navy wanted to add massive hull blisters welded along her sides to improve buoyancy and damage survivability. Instead, the fix nearly ruined her. When she returned to sea, Midway rolled like a drunk. Even in moderate seas, the deck pitched violently, sending aircraft lurching, as if the ocean were trying to throw them overboard. Catapults bucked, arresting wires snapped taut with terrifying force, and the whole ship shuddered with each swell. It didn't take long for the crew to give her a new nickname, the Rock and Roll Carrier. Sailors laughed, cursed, and gripped whatever they could when the deck shifted under their boots. Midway's stability was so compromised that the Navy briefly considered retiring her outright. Only a $138 million corrective program, complete with studies proposing notched hulls, spray rails, and modified bulbs, kept her alive. Despite the technical studies and planned modifications, the hazards of life aboard Midway never disappeared. The reminder came violently on June 20th, 1990. Deep below decks, 2 explosions, likely triggered by mishandled munitions or a fuel system failure, ripped through compartments and set off a fire that raged for over 10 hours. The ship rolled and shuddered as damage control teams fought both flame and motion. 11 members of the flying squad, Midway's first responders, were lost or critically wounded in the effort to save the ship. When Midway pulled into Yokosuka the following day, the international press was waiting for them. Helicopters circled overhead, while reporters crowded the pier, cameras clicking and rolling. Press coverage fixated on the mishap, emphasizing the challenges of operating a 45-year-old carrier. Many expected the carrier to be retired immediately because of her age, yet Midway remained in service, preparing for one final major conflict. By the winter of 1990, Midway was no longer the sleek new giant she had been decades earlier. She bore the scars of collisions, typhoons, and fire, yet the refits kept her relevant. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August, the carrier was ordered to the Persian Gulf. Her flight deck bristled with power. Supersonic FA-18 Hornets, all-weather A-6 intruders, and EA-6B prowlers loaded with electronic warfare gear. On November 1st, she relieved USS Independence as flagship of Battle Force Zulu and led Operation Imminent Thunder, directing 1,100 aircraft, 16 warships, and 1,000 Marines in one of the largest amphibious exercises of the war. Then, at 2 a.m. on January 17, 1991, the war broke out. Midway's A-6E tram intruders roared off the deck and into the night, becoming the first carrier strikes of Operation Desert Storm. They tore across the Kuwaiti coast, guided by radar and infrared pods, while supporting aircraft rose in their wake. Hours later, intruders skimmed low toward Shaiba Air Base, bomb racks heavy, anti-aircraft fire hammering the sky. The wall of fire was so fierce that 2 bomb runs had to be aborted. At the same time, 3 intruders clawed through, dropping Mark 83s on airfields at Ahmad al-Jaber. By dawn, the wall of fire at Shaiba convinced Midway pilots to abandon low-level tactics for the rest of the war. Remarkably, no aircraft were lost. That first day alone, Midway and Ranger launched 228 sorties from the Gulf, while Kennedy and Saratoga struck from the Red Sea, and Tomahawks arced in from 9 ships across 3 theaters. Midway's jets kept pushing the envelope as the war ground on. A Hornet from her deck fired the first AGM-62 Walleye in combat, vaporizing a command building at Qasir. Another strike used a Walleye to destroy an Iraqi Super Freelon armed with Exocet missiles, removing a direct threat to the carriers themselves. By the time the air campaign reached its climax, Midway had flown thousands of sorties, coordinated coalition fleets, and proved that even an aging carrier, in the hands of a seasoned crew, could still anchor victory. On March 11th, she steamed out of the Gulf and returned to Yokosuka, with her legacy cemented. By the early 1990s, USS Midway was almost unrecognizable from the carrier that first sailed in 1945. She'd been born as a straight-deck flat-top for piston-engine Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers. Nearly half a century later, she was launching supersonic Hornets and all-weather intruders from a hardened, angled deck. The carrier's 4 shafts were still powered by her original 12 Babcock & Wilcox boilers, providing speeds up to 33 knots. Still, her propulsion and engineering systems had been overhauled to support sustained, high-tempo flight operations. Her hull had been strengthened for stability, her electronics modernized to enable precision strike warfare, and her gun batteries replaced with close-in defenses against missiles. The silhouette was still that of a World War II carrier. 900 feet of steel, but now the deck bristled with jets, jammers, and guided weapons. The past and the future were fused into one ship. Even in her final years, she remained indispensable. In 1991, after leading strikes in Desert Storm, Midway steamed to the Philippines for Operation Fiery Vigil, evacuating more than 20,000 people from Clark Air Base as Mount Pinatubo buried the landscape in ash. It was the last great service of a ship that had weathered decades of battle, disaster, and near disaster alike. That August, she departed Yokosuka for the final time, turning over forward deployed duty to USS Independence. The stop in Seattle gave her crew one last chance to welcome family aboard before she continued on to San Diego. There, after 47 years at sea, Midway was finally decommissioned. She'd outlasted many of her contemporaries. For those who had called her home, the rock and roll carrier was a living chronicle of their shared history, courage, and camaraderie.